What's going on, guys? Nathan here with a Magic the Gathering Commander deck tech video featuring Derevi Empyrial Tactician. This is my first Magic the Gathering deck tech video, and I hope to be doing more content like this in the future. So if you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like and subscribe, and hopefully we will get through all 55 of my Commander decks. So a quick overview of the deck before we get into it. Derevi is a commander that is focused on tapping and untapping creatures for value. He is a 3-mana Bant commander, 2/3 flyer bird wizard. Whenever Derevi Empyrial Tactician ETBs or a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may tap or untap target permanent. And his second ability is also very important. At any time, you can pay 4 mana at instant speed, put Derevi onto the battlefield from the command zone. So this deck is more about generating value from tap and untap abilities. Derevi has a bit of a stigma in the commander community for being kind of a stax commander because people will often pair it with cards like Winter Orb, which prevent your opponents from untapping permanents while you break that parity and are able to untap permanents via your commander. Instead, we are focusing on using Derevi as a value piece. His first ability, a triggered ability, essentially says every time that a creature you control deals combat damage, you get to activate your best tap ability on the battlefield again. And it can also get around the commander tax by paying the activated ability 4 mana at any time to put Derevi onto the battlefield, meaning that for 4 mana at instant speed, you can always activate your best value ability, or if you need to untap a creature, you can have a blocker in a pinch. So Derevi is super valuable because it is always available to disrupt your opponent's game plan and provide you value, regardless of how many times it's removed. So a little bit of summary stats before we get into the video. So I like to look at Moxfield to calculate my average converted mana cost. And if we actually go over to Moxfield really quick to take a look at this, I have some custom mana costs baked in. Particularly any X spells are going to feature, are going to be on the 5 CMC curve. But right now we are actually running a 3.95 average mana curve, which is a little bit high for your average mid-range deck. However, the deck comes packed with 37 lands and I believe 15 pieces of ramp. So we're going to have plenty of mana production to meet that average CMC. And just a quick note on that as well, I do have some cards in the land categories such as Generous Ent, Lorien Revealed, and Eagles of the North, which basically function as MDFC tapped lands when they are cycled using their second ability. So those are treated as if they don't exist. In fact, I pulled them out of the calc completely to get to that 3.95 curve. So I just wanted to provide some stipulation around that number to provide some additional context. Additionally, we have a couple of creature types that matters. We have 18 elves in the deck, 6 wizards, which I'll cover in just a little bit, 35 tap abilities, and 16 untap effects in the deck, including Derevi and some niche cards that kind of function as untap abilities such as Teferi's Protection and Expropriate. There are 2 infinite combos in the deck. Intruder Alarm plus 3-Ben Doomsayer is a 2-card combo to produce infinite 1/1s without haste, and Intruder Alarm plus Kazandu Tuskcaller will also do the same thing, but they will produce 3/3 elephants without haste. Combo is not the end goal of the deck. In fact, I've intentionally excluded all tutors to search for Intruder Alarm. It's treated more as a value piece in this deck, but in case we do come across these cards, they can be used to quickly finish out a game if our opponents do not have a board wipe to get rid of the infinite tokens. All right, so let's start with the cards that will be providing the most amount of value, our Untappers. The rest of the deck has is heavily focused on creatures with tap abilities, but the Untappers are how we're going to be generating an insane amount of value. So first off, we have Curse of Bounty. It's a curse. Whenever enchanted player is attacked, untap all non-land permanents you control. Each opponent attacking that player untaps all non-land permanents he or she controls. This is great and can function. The ceiling of this card is essentially a 2-mana untap all of our non-land permanents 4 times per turn cycle. The caveat, though, is that often our opponents, I think, will recognize that attacking the player that is cursed will give us a lot of value, and so you can't reliably count on that ceiling to be the case. But I even prefer to look at it as a 2 untap triggers per turn cycle because we always assume that there's probably going to be one player who's maybe behind and will need the extra value generated from the curse. Drumbellower is a great untapper, 3-mana 2/1 spirit flyer, untap all creatures you control during each other player's untap step. This is the exact kind of card we always want to have on the battlefield so that we can untap our value generators. Finale of Devastation is going to function as either Drumbellower or Seedborn Muse that we can tutor up, and it pulls double duty because we can pay 12 mana to trigger its second clause, which is to give our creatures +X/+X and haste until end of turn, which is at least 10. So in a pinch, this can function as a finisher if we happen to have mana lying around after a board wipe or something. And if we do have creatures that we maybe want to swing out with an Alpha Strike, we can search up either Craterhoof Behemoth or Moonshaker Cavalry to finish that way. Intruder Alarm, already covered this a little bit. This is a combo piece, but is also used to generate a lot of value in the deck. It essentially says, whenever a creature comes into play, untap all creatures, meaning that, and if we actually cover our creature types really quick, jumping back to Moxfield, we have 44 creatures in the deck. This would actually be 46, including Eagles of the North and Generous Ent. And so the Intruder Alarm will provide a lot of value. Every time we cast a spell, we untap all of our creatures. So that's going to be an insane amount of value. Invasion of Ikoria is going to function similarly if we actually pull this up on Moxfield because it's a little bit cleaner this way. It's going to function as a tutor again for Seedborn Muse or Drumbellower, or maybe if those have already been removed off of the board, we can search up something like a White Plume Adventurer, which is going to pull or provide similar value. And this also pulls double duty as a finisher because we can put the battle under control of the opponent who is the least able to defend it. And when we attack and hit it for 6 damage, it will flip into Zalortha, Apex of Ikoria, which I actually think it's better to display this on tapped out. It's an 8/8 dinosaur with reach. For each non-human creature you control, you may have that creature assign as combat damage as though it weren't blocked. So essentially gives all of our creatures unblockable, providing us that evasion that we can use to both get through our opponent's defenses and to also get those combat damage triggers off of Derevi. Mercfiend Liege is a double duty in this category as well. Lots of value because it's going to provide a Lord buff for green and blue creatures, and it's going to untap all green and blue creatures like we control during each other player's untap steps. So a lot of value there. A quick note on the color stipulation: there are 6 white creatures with tap abilities that won't be affected by this. So of the 40 some odd creatures, there's only 6 that are not that will be a non-bow with this ability. So what I'm thinking of in particular is Thraben Doomsayer, Preacher, and Intrepid Hero, Dogged Hunter. So a few in the removal category, and I believe that is mostly it. The rest of these, I believe, and Machias, that would be the other one. So long story short, Mercfiend Liege still a great option in the deck and a great tutor target if Seedborn Muse happened to have been removed off of the board. Seedborn Muse is kind of what this deck is built around. It is arguably the best creature in the deck, and it is a magnet for removal. Your opponents will often target this because it just provides so much value. The stipulation here that I wanted to mention is we're mostly going to be using it for the untapping creature effect. We don't have a ton of instants that can leverage the instant speed that untapping our lands allows us to cast those spells. So we're going to be using mostly it for a drum bellower type of effect, but it is still the best creature in the deck because we can at least threaten a counter spell. And in fact, if you wanted to go more of that protection route, I would maybe substitute some of the more value or arguably jankier option in the removal category for some counter spells. Sting the Glinting Dagger is going to allow us to untap one creature per combat. So one creature, and that's each combat, even on our opponent's turns. And what makes this card an all-star is it also gives the creature haste. So it's going to be enabling our value tappers a ton, and we can play it for on turn 2 for only 2 mana. Although most of the time we'll want to be considering this as a 4 cost by playing it and equipping it right away. White Plume Adventurer is a similar effect as Sting because it allows us to untap one creature we control during each other player's turn. And it's not often we're going to be completing a dungeon with the initiative, so we can't really count on untapping all creatures we control, although there is some possibility of that happening. But what I also like about White Plume Adventurer in this deck is that it allows us to take the initiative right away, which essentially means in the first room we get to tutor for a basic land card, put it into our hand. So that's going to be mana fixing us for turn 4, which is perfect because most of our creatures, our value creatures, are in that 3 and 4 slot. So just a great value proposition in White Plume Adventurer. Okay, so with our Untappers out of the way, let's hit on the ramp cards a little bit. The ramp cards have a special theme in that they need to be elves. There are certain cards that are payoffs for elves in this deck. I'm thinking particularly of Immaculate Magistrate, and some of our ramp pieces also scale off of the number of elves we control. So some of let me just run through these really quick. Bloom Tender is always going to be tapping for 3, and this is perfect because we can cast it on turn 2, and on turn 3 we can then cast Derevi so that Bloom Tender will tap for 3 mana in Bant colors. Boreal Druid is the weakest 1 mana dork, however it is still efficient at that 1 mana slot because it only adds colorless. But it's still very efficient for what it does. Canopy Tactician is going to be a 4 mana tap for 3 with a Lord effect. This is pretty good, although it's not that efficient at 4 mana, but you're still totally happy to ramp on turn 3 or turn 4. Circle of Dreams Druid is essentially Gaia's Cradle on a creature, and again, being an elf, it's just a great include being we're going to have a lot of creatures on board. Elvish Archdruid, again, that elf synergy, even with this on the field, I always assume that we'll have maybe one other elf on the field. So I always assume worst case scenario, we'll have 2 elves on the battlefield, meaning that this will always at least tap for 2 mana. Elvish Harbinger, one of our least efficient ramp pieces. However, it allows us to have that card selection with elves. And in fact, if we look at kind of what we can tutor up several ramp pieces. Pretty much every card in our ramp slot is an elf, with the exception of Karametra's Acolyte. But what we can also search up is card draw with Beast Whisperer, removal with Glissa Sunseeker, and then Immaculate Magistrate to start capitalizing on some of our elves that are on the battlefield. Let's see. And then we have some very efficient 1 mana dorks. Elvish Mystic, everybody knows what this does. Fiend Horn Elves, just very efficient. Jalanra is an elf mana dork that is not super efficient because it doesn't tap for more than one. However, if we can untap this and use this mana to cast multiple creatures in turn, we can start drawing cards with it. This would be the first cut that I would look at out of the ramp slot. If you were looking to change up some of the ramp in this category, for example, Wirewood Channeler would be another one that we can maybe slot in here. But I did choose to exclude Wirewood Channel in favor of Jalanra, mostly because it comes down on turn 3, and we just need a little bit of extra card draw in the deck to make it just that much better. Growing Rites of Itlimoc is essentially Gaia's Cradle that cantrips. The stipulation for it flipping is that we need 4 more creatures on the battlefield, and in a deck that's so creature heavy like this, we're pretty much always going to be always going to have it, and because it's legendary, it can be tutored by Captain Cisse. So just a great ramp piece here. Gyre Sage is a 1/2 Elf Druid with Evolve, where it taps for green for each 1/1 counter on it. This will always tap for 2 mana because essentially if we play this on turn 2, we can play Derevi on turn 3, add the 1/1 counter because Derevi has 2 power, and then allow it to tap for 2 mana. So very efficient mana dork there. Karametra's Acolyte is another classic in green Elf Ball, although I also do not consider this to be an Elf Ball deck because we're not leveraging as many elf synergies, although we have just enough to make us dangerous in the ramp category here. But Karametra's Acolyte, 4 mana, 1/4 human druid, added amount of green to your mana pool equal to your devotion to green, which is almost always going to be at least 2 or 3. Even if we were, just had a couple of pieces picked off, we're almost always going to have some permanents on the field that have green pips. So this at minimum will tap for about 3, worst case scenario. Llanowar Elves, another efficient 1/1 dork. Llanowar Tribe, and a very efficient 3 mana taps for 3, another great piece there. And then Priest of Titania, again leveraging that elf synergy. If we assume that there are going to be at least 2 elves on the battlefield for us, this will at least tap for 2. And I just had a analysis to show you guys as well, because I like stats and kind of looking at things in a table, and I think this helps kind of provide some context for what we're looking at. So in column C, we have the cost of the mana dork, D, what it produces, and then an efficiency rating in column E. And we can see here that our lowest efficiency mana dorks that I already explained is Elvish Arbinger and Jalanra Collar of Wirewood. And again, our most efficient would be Bloom Tender, which pretty much always going to tap for 3, and Priest of Titania. In this particular analysis, I put that it taps for 3. We can maybe fine tune this a little bit, but our next all-stars are going to be Growing Rites of Itlimoc and Karametra's Acolyte. And we can see here that we can see how many cards in each cost category we have. This is very important because it helps you to plan out kind of how the turns are going to progress. We have a lot of mana dorks in the 3 CMC slot. To be honest, I would have preferred to have more in the 1 mana slot. However, I couldn't find any more elves that fit in the 1 mana slot. There are options such as Birds of Paradise. You could even consider Ornithopter of Paradise if you wanted kind of that flying ability, to put 1/1 counters on them to deal combat damage to trigger Derevi. That is an option that I considered. There's even Delighted Halfling you can maybe even consider, but we really want to leverage those elf synergies, and so I was forced to sort of move up the CMC of the ramp into the 2 and 3 category. But our third most popular category is the 2 CMC slot, and then just a couple in the 4 CMC slots. The other thing I wanted to mention really quick, I already covered Wirewood Channeler. That is an option that you can include in the deck, but Elvish Guidance is another great option here. In fact, this has tremendous synergy with elves because it is an enchant land. Whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds green to his mana pool for each elf in play. And the beauty of this is that you can tap the land the moment it comes down, assuming that you have the untapped land. So it would have to be turn 4 or later that we would have that land available, or even, I guess, turn 3 if we played a Mana Dork earlier than that. But Elvish Guidance is another one that I cut that you could consider throwing in, that I think can provide a ton of mana. All right, so let's move on to everybody's second favorite category here. What is banned without a little bit of card draw? There are some options here that are a little bit jank, I'm not going to lie. And the poster boy for this is Arcanus the Omnipotent, a 6-mana 3/4 wizard. It can tap to draw 3 cards, and in a pinch we can pay 4 to bounce it back to our hand. It's quite an expensive ability, so I don't anticipate we would ever do this. But this is where I want to provide that commentary where this deck is kind of at that 6 to 7 power level. We're not leveraging the ultra staples that would absolutely power up this deck. For example, there could be a case to run Consecrated Sphinx and automatically draw 6 cards the turn cycle that it comes down. However, I wanted to keep this on theme and very flavorful with all of the tap and untap sort of soft synergies we can generate. So Arcanus is going to be our all-star 6 mana, with the ceiling being that we can tap it to draw 12 cards per turn cycle if our opponents somehow let this thing live. I have yet to see an Arcanus live more than 2 turns. However, it is in here for the soft synergy and the absolute bonkers ceiling that it can provide. Archivist is kind of in that same category. It's a 1/1 human wizard. You can tap it to draw a card. Again, with something like a Drumbeller on the field, the ceiling here is that we would be drawing 4 cards a turn cycle, and this is just that flavorful synergy that I like to have in a tap-untap deck, even though it's a 4-mana do-nothing the turn it comes down. Azami, Lady of Scrolls, we can tap an untap wizard we control, draw a card, which means we can use the ability the moment it comes down. So this is great if we already have something like a Drumbeller on the battlefield. We can slam it, tap it, and then start untapping it to draw more cards. And the synergy here is with Derevi, we can actually tap Derevi to generate that extra card draw if we don't need the combat damage trigger from him. Or her. I don't know what gender, actually, Derevi is. I'm going to assume it's a him. Beast Whisperer does not have that tap-on-tap synergy. However, it is an elf. It powers up our elf synergies, and we are very creature-heavy, so we are always going to be drawing cards off of Beast Whisperer. Captain Sisay is one of our most powerful draw cards, and I'm actually going to pull up a non-crusty version that has a new border because I really prefer to look at this style of card. We can tap to search your library for a legendary card, reveal that card, and put it into our hand. So the synergy here, again, potentially up to 4 times a turn cycle, we can be searching and tutoring for legendary cards. Now, what can we grab with Captain Sisay? Well, I have a little bit of a guide here. So in our ramp category, we have the Growing Rights of Itlamok. We have a few options for removal, such as Empress Galena, Glissa Sunseeker, and Lauren of the Third Path, which is also great card advantage. We can search up Sting the Glinting Dagger for untapped synergies. Additional things that will help us draw cards are Arcanus, Azami, Shorakai, and the One Ring. And then we can also search up some finishers such as Elish Norn and Machias. So that is just a great value generator in the card draw category. Intellectual Offering does everything we want to do. It's a 5-mana instant, and we love instants in this deck because we might have Seedborn Muse on the battlefield. Choose an opponent, you and that player each draw 3 cards, which for 5-mana instant speed is about on rate. It's not something we're happy with. However, it's the second part that really puts this card over the edge, which is to untap all non-land permanents you control and all non-land permanents another opponent controls. So the case here is that you choose your the opponent that is behind the most, or perhaps to curry some favor with. You actually want to be making a a deal and leveraging politics at the table to say, hey, everybody, I have an intellectual offering. How about you, scary opponent over there? Do not attack me, and I will let you draw 3 cards, and you can actually leverage more value out of this card with a political strategy. And then you say, okay, Voltron player, person that doesn't really use a lot of creatures, you can untap all non-land permanents you control, and maybe if they're playing at sorcery speed, it's not going to matter that much. Selvala Explorer Returned is one of the last cards that I've added to this category, and one of the first that I would cut. It's a little bit in experimentation phase. 3 mana, 2/4. It's an elf, which is awesome in this deck. That elf synergy matters a ton. A parlay, each player reveals the top card for each LM card revealed this way, add green and you gain 1 life. Then each player draws a card. So it provides us both card advantage and mana, and we're going to assume that based on everybody having about 38 lands in their deck, we'll probably hit at least 2 mana each time this ability is activated. The thing is, if we try to abuse it a bunch during the turn cycle, we're feeding a lot of cards to our opponents. That's why this one admittedly is still a little bit experimental, and I'm going to see, is the extra card draw we're giving to our opponents worth it? But other than that, it really has everything we're looking for. It generates mana, it generates card advantage, and it is an elf. So that's pretty much everything we're looking for. Shurikai Genesis Engine, I think a lot of people know what this does. What we're going to do is play this we're going to consider this a 5 CMC spell, because what we want to do is pay 1 to tap it right away, draw 2 cards, discard a card, and then create a 1/1 pilot. So again, we're generating card advantage, generating board state, and this thing is an artifact, so it will not be swept up in a board wipe, and it will just continue to draw us cards, and this thing does a lot of work behind the scenes. The One Ring, I think, is pretty obvious. I'm not going to really explain why this one is in the deck. We're just going to be drawing a ton of cards off of it. And then finally, we have Tribute to the World Tree. Whenever creature ETB is under our control, draw a card if its power is 3 or greater. Otherwise, put 2 1/1 counters on it. Now, I did some math, and we have around 16 creatures that already enter with power 3 or greater. So about a fourth of the time that we play a creature, this is going to be drawing us a card. However, what's not included in that calculation, and what actually is important, is we have a couple of lords here, at least 4 in the deck. Canopy Tactician, Elvish Archdruid are going to provide these lord buffs, which will buff our elves up to 2 power. Or, I'm sorry, up to an additional power. And for those elves that actually enter with 2 power, we can perform a little scan here. So if we say, Mercfiend Liege is also going to provide us a buff. So something that might be on the edge that might draw us a card with those buffs would be something like Beast Whisperer. We also have Circle of Dreams Druid. There's a couple here. Elvish Archdruid that can be buffed up to 3 power. And the way that works is if they are being static buffed as they enter the battlefield, that applies even when the ETB triggers on the stack from Tribute. So it will actually trigger the card draw if it enters with 2 power. We have Gyre Sage, which can, well, that one probably won't qualify, but Immaculate Magistrate is another that's on the 2 power. Imperious Perfect. So there's a few other cards that can be buffed that will trigger card draw from Tribute to the World Tree. So just more soft synergy that we're sort of baking in. And once we factor those in, I think it's safe to assume that we'd have about, if we assume all of the lords will help draw us additional cards from buffing those creatures up to 3 power, we can assume maybe 3 to 4 cards on average in that sort of calculation. And so we can say, okay, about a third of our creatures will be generating card draw on ETB. But regardless, this is always going to be doing what we want to do by buffing our board or drawing cards. Let me touch on the finishers then, because now that we know how we're kind of generating value, how do we actually capitalize and close out the game? So we have classic finisher Akroma's Will. This does double duty in a Derevi deck, because not only does it give our creatures vigilance to allow them to tap in our second main phase, it gives them double strike for double combat damage triggers, and it can be used to protect our creatures in a pinch as well. So it's just an absolute all-star in this deck for only 4 mana. Crater Hoof and Moonshaker Cavalry are both in the deck. These excuse me, are kind of generic win cons. I'm not really at the point where I've started to pull Crater Hoof from my decks just because I know that there's such a common win con. A lot of people can kind of get bored with them, but there's just no better way to capitalize on a board we've built up and give our creatures evasion to get those combat damage triggers. We also have Elish Norn. Now, you can replace Elish Norn with another overrun effect that will provide evasion. However, what I like to do with my finishers is consider can they be played off of the back heel if we are losing to our opponents. I always try to like to build in some defense into our higher CMC bombs, and Elish Norn is just always going to do work with our opponent's creatures by giving them a static -2/-2. This will shut down a lot of strategies like tokens. Often aristocrats can be crippled by this because your blood artists, your Zulapur cutthroats are very low power and toughness. And it will also just clear the way of any mana dorks and utility creatures while providing us a sizable buff, which you can basically consider to be creatures you control on +4/+4 because of the differential there. Endray's Forerunners is just another great overrun effect, and this one it also has extra synergy because it gives our creatures vigilance, allowing us to attack and then tap in the second main phase. Expropriate is another generic finisher that, you know, I know people don't really like to see Expropriate. It's kind of a salt-inducing card. However, it is extra beneficial in our deck because that extra turn will allow us to have an extra untap phase. And so, you know, if I wanted to power up the deck, you would include a ton of extra turn spells because it basically just says give ourselves an extra untap phase. But it's also going to help us to steal our opponent's best things, providing a great defensive tactic. Azuri's Predation is going to generate us a board state while clearing the way from our opponents. And this is essentially reads destroy all creatures your opponents control with power 3 or less, and for every creature your opponents control with power 4 or greater, destroy all those creatures with toughness 3 or less, and give yourself a 4/4 green Phyrexian Beast token. The fatties, unfortunately, that the 4/4s are going to fight are going to survive, but this, again, pulls double duty by being both offense and defense, and if you wanted to include more evasion into the deck to capitalize on a board state, this is where I would maybe consider adding a Earthshaker Giant, for example, or maybe even an archetype of Imagination, which, let me just pull those up really quick. Earthshaker Giant will give your creatures +3/+3 and trample on ETB, so that's a great option at only 6 CMC. And then archetype of Imagination will give your creatures flying, and creatures in opponent's control lose flying and can't have or gain flying. So basically it gives your creatures unblockable. And the other piece that I was going to throw out too is you can maybe even consider including True Conviction in this slot as well, because it will give your creatures double strike, which will help to get those Derevi combat triggers. However, that's also dependent on the fact that you can get through, and quite often board states will sort of gum up, which is why I don't really quite like True Conviction in this deck. Sarah's Emissary is going to fit that bill of being great in both offense and defense. Typically with this card, you name creatures as the card type, and then you and creatures you control have protection from creatures, which means that they cannot be blocked by, and you cannot be dealt damage by creatures. So it's great on both defense because it will turn off all of your opponent's combat damage, and it's great on offense because you can get in for that evasive combat swing. Subjugate the Hobbits is one that I am including as sort of a pet card. I'm still experimenting with this a little bit. It's a 7-mana sorcery. Gain control of each non-commander creature with mana value 3 or less. This card, I think, is getting better with time as creatures sort of skew more to that 3 CMC or less spot as creatures become more cheap for what they do. This is going to allow you to just take control of your opponent's entire board. you could consider, again, if you wanted more of that Alpha Strike capability, is where I would consider running like an Earthshaker Giant over this card. However, this fits that defensive slot where we're going to be taking control of our opponent's creatures even when we might not even have a board state ourselves. So this nukes token decks, this nukes, again, like aristocrat type of decks, and just all utility creatures and mana dorks you're going to be stealing, which is exactly what we want to be doing when we're behind. Thought-provoking Gambit is one of those cards that is not insanely powerful, but it has great synergy in this particular deck because we can pay 6 mana at instant speed to tap all creatures our opponents control and untap all creatures we control. So what you can do is you can, at the start of your turn in your first main phase, you tap all of your creatures for value, and then you cast Thought-provoking Gambit to then make all of your opponent's creatures tapped, and you can then untap your creatures to either attack or tap for value again. So just a great finisher there overall. For our token producers, we are going to want some more elves, and we can get that from Imperious Perfect, which is a 3-mana 2/2 Elf Warrior Lord, and we can pay 1 and tap to create a 1/1 green Elf Warrior creature token. In this slot, I was also considering Presence of Gond, which actually does go infinite with Intruder Alarm. However, the reason why Presence of Gond is not in the deck is because it's an aura. There is the possibility of potentially attaching this to a creature we control that already has a valuable tap ability that we don't want to give up, and we also can be 2 for 1 if an opponent were to instant speed Swords to Plowshares that creature. So I don't like being 2 for 1. I don't really know anybody who does, and so for that reason we don't really run Presence of God, although I can see the argument for it, considering that you don't need to pay the 1. Now I will say that with Imperious Perfect on the field, you are always going to be creating 2/2s because of the static buff that Imperious Perfect gives you. So it's effectively 1 mana, create a 2/2 elf, which can matter with that extra power and toughness. Kazandu Tusk Collar is a bit of an obscure card. And I flip-flopped on this card a ton, but I did end up including it in the deck over Presence of God because I think it can really do work. You can play this on turn 2 for only 2 mana, and then the goal would be to level it up once to then give us the ability to create a 3/3 green token by tapping it. We're pretty much never going to activate it all the way up to level 6. That would be an insane amount of mana to pay for that ability, but there's the potential that, again, with something like a Drumbeller on the battlefield, we're paying 4 mana to create 4 3/3s every turn cycle, which I think is worth it. And if we have a bunch of mana dorks sitting around, not a lot to do with that mana, we can, in a pinch, pay it up to level 6 to enhance the ability. And then finally, we have Thraben Doomsayer, which is a 3-mana 2/2 human cleric, tap to create a 1/1 human creature token. And then the Fate Flower will almost never be relevant, but it can be a buff in 0.01% of cases. All right, let's touch on the removal then. First off, we are going to start off with the best Selesnya artifact and enchantment removal in the game, which is Aura Shards. Given that we're very creature heavy, this is always going to be doing work, and I don't feel that I need to explain this card much further because of how much value it generates. Beguiler of Will, 5-mana 1/1 human wizard, tap to gain control of target creature with power less than or equal to the number of creatures you control. Again, we're going to be having a large board state. We're going to have a lot of mana dorks, meaning that this is going to be able to tap for quite a bit off the start, and this is simply a must-answer card. Otherwise, if we have, even activating this once per turn cycle is pretty devastating to always steal your opponent's best thing, assuming they meet the power clause. But the other piece is if we have a Drumbeller on the battlefield, we're going to be sniping creatures four times a turn cycle, which is pretty crazy, and the power clause is not going to mean anything because we're just going to be building a massive board state. Callous Oppressor, I'm going to bring up my new card here, is a 1/2 Cephalid. You may choose not to untap it during your untap step. When ETB is an opponent, choose a creature type. and then you can tap to gain control of target creature that isn't of the chosen type for as long as Callous Oppressor remains tapped. So this card requires a little bit of explanation. First, we're going to want to target the opponent who is behind the most or has perhaps not as many creatures on board that will want to steal. And this card can function serve in two functions. First, if we want to snipe our opponent's best creature and keep Callous Oppressor tapped, that is great. Now we have our opponent's best creature. However, what we can do if we have a Drumbeller on the battlefield is we can always basically negate the most dangerous creature on our opponent's board, because if it untaps on your opponent's turn, you can then tap it to then take control of whatever creature you think is going to attack you or you are most afraid of. And so then on the next opponent's turn, you're going to untap the Callous Oppressor, give that creature back, and then take the creature that is the most dangerous again. So it's a very, it allows you to be very safe by negating your opponent's best creature, almost like a Maze of Ith type of effect, which I also considered including in the deck. However, the other way you can generate value is by using this as a political tool, because you can say, okay, opponent A, you have a very scary Galta over there. I have the ability to tap this right now, and if you don't hit me with Galta, I won't take control of that. And maybe I won't even take control of anything, because you can threaten the activation at any time at instant speed. So you can basically use it in a political sense to point dangerous creatures to your opponents on the other side of the board. So there's just a ton of value that is sitting in Callous Oppressor, and the creature type clause, you know, it is a little relevant, but typically you can negate it by choosing the opponent that maybe is the most behind, or that maybe just is not using very many creatures in their strategy. Dogged Hunter is a little bit of a jankier option, and this would be one of the first that's on the chopping block. However, it does do work, I have found. It's a 3-mana 1/1 human nomad, tap to destroy target creature token. Now, that is a huge clause, because tokens are not always on the board. However, I have found that quite often they are. There are so many tribal decks that generate tokens. There are devoted token decks. There are all-stars in the format that generate tokens, such as Irenicus's Vile Duplication creates a token of your commander. There is the blue all-star C double that will create a token. So clone decks are definitely affected by this. Anything that makes a copy of your commander, quite common in the format. So I've always found that Dogged Hunter has a relevant target. And again, for the same reason as Callous Oppressor, you can use this in a political fashion to negotiate where certain attacks are going to go. Empress Galena is going to allow us to pay 2 blue mana to tap, gain control of target legend or legendary permanent, and in a format where decks are built around your one and only legend in the command zone, this is a great ability. Glissa Sunseeker is a 4-mana 3/2 with first strike elf, very important. Tap to destroy target artifact if its CMC is less than or equal to the amount of mana in your mana pool, which is an interesting clause. I had to turn this over quite a bit in my head before I realized that clause pretty much does not matter, because quite often you're going to be able to generate value off of this by sniping soul rings, talismans, signets, a lot of utility artifacts such as what is the millstone that always utility artifacts for mill decks, things like that, where we're always going to have one land that we can either keep open if we want to activate this on our opponent's turn, or we can just tap a land anyway for a spell we were going to cast anyway, and then tap it to use the ability. So this restriction is kind of interesting. It limits us mostly when we want to use this at instant speed, but at sorcery speed we can absolutely use this without needing to worry about the mana clause. And if we want to target high CMC artifacts, well, essentially we already have mana dorks that we're going to be playing, so we can get up to those higher levels of mana to snipe those higher cost artifacts. Intrepid here is going to be a great value piece for pretty much any board state. Tap to destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. There's always going to be something threatening on the board, and again, you can leverage this from a political perspective to point dangerous creatures elsewhere. Lorna, the third path, always an all-star. ETBs destroy up to 1 artifact or enchantment, and you can tap it, you and target opponent each draw a card. Again, a great political tool to say, hey, we need to dig for some removal. Opponent A, you seem to be behind, or maybe, you seem to have the most removal. Let's try to draw you a card to dig into some additional resources that can help us to snipe something off of the board that will kill the whole table. Patron Wizard is a 2/2 wizard for 3 mana, and we can tap an untapped wizard we control to counter target spell unless its controller pays 1 colorless. This is important to leverage with Derevi. This might even be on the chopping block, but especially if you wanted to look at more staples to run for the deck. For example, I would run Mana Drain over this card if I wanted to immediately increase the power level of the deck. However, the tap clause has that extra synergy with Derevi, and we can always threaten this with something like a Drumbeller on the battlefield, where we're always going to force our opponents to think about how they can sequence their plays, because we can be threatened to essentially mana tithe it at any point in time. Preacher has a lot of text, and I'm going to bring up the new version of this card because it is less crusty and has a simpler text box. So this is the Gatherer Eroded text box for Preacher. You may choose not to untap Preacher during your untap step. It's a 1/1 for 3 mana human cleric. Tap for as long as Preacher remains tapped, gain control of target creature of an opponent's choice that they control. So you might be asking, okay, why would we be running a card that nets us our opponent's worst creature? And the reason why we want to do this is similar rationale for Callous Oppressor. We can always target the opponent with the least amount of creatures on the battlefield, and also, if we play this on turn 2 or turn 3, often players will only have their commanders on the battlefield, meaning that we can actually activate this to take somebody's commander and negate a large synergy piece. And additionally, if our opponents only have a couple of really scary creatures, and with something like a Drumbeller on the battlefield, to always be able to negate even their worst creature is something that I think is very valuable in the deck. For example, if there's a particular combat damage trigger or something like that we don't want to happen, while our opponent only has, maybe 1 or 2 creatures on the battlefield. I'm thinking more of like fatty decks, where, maybe there's just like a old Gnawbone or something on the battlefield. We can hopefully gain control of that. This one is a little bit more in the experimentation phase. I haven't quite, sussed out whether this is worth that 3 mana of value, but I think that being able to do this every 4 times a turn cycle, and negate your opponent's worst creature is still worth that 3 mana. So we are going to go back here, and that is the rest of our removal category. Finally, we have a couple more categories to cover, a little bit more miscellaneous category. Our buffer category starts with Great Oak Guardian. It's a 4/5 tree folk with flash and reach. When it ETBs, creatures target player controls get +2/+2 until end of turn and untap them. So because this has flash, we love it because we can play it at instant speed to surprise our opponents, maybe in combat or just to generate extra value. Or we can use it as a combat buff when we're helping to swing in, where maybe we tap our creatures in our first main phase and then we want to buff them to swing in, and then we can untap them to be able to use them in combat. So just a really flexible card overall. Immaculate Magistrate is going to be a 2/2 for 4 mana elf shaman. Put one counter on target creature for each elf you control. So this is going to be great just to kind of passively provide buffs to our team. You really want to use this with something like a Seedborn Muse or Drumbeller on the battlefield, because activating this once a turn kind of is not that good for 4 mana. This is an all-star in elf decks, but even if we assume, I'm always assuming that we're running with the floor case of this card, which is that we'll have 2 elves on the battlefield. So to generate 8 power per turn cycle for 4 mana, to me, is worth it. However, if we don't have the Drumbeller on the battlefield, this is going to fall off quite a bit, and to be able to only produce 2 power per turn cycle. So Immaculate Magistrate, a little bit dependent on if you have elves and other synergy, but that's exactly what we're building this deck around, is to enable these soft synergies. Finally, Mikaeus the Lunarch for the buff category is a 0/0 for X and a white human cleric. When ETBs with X, 1 counters on it, tap, put a 1 counter on it, and tap to remove 1 counter from Mikaeus. Put a 1 counter on each other creature you control. So Mikaeus is an all-star when you can cast him for 2 or maybe even 3 mana, because what you want to do is, let's say you don't have a mana dork to play on turn 2, maybe you didn't draw them, but you have a Mikaeus in hand. You cast it where X is equal to 1, it enters as a 1/1, and then next go around, when it comes back to your turn, you tap it to put a 1 counter on it, so that next time, whenever you play more creatures, you can then tap to remove a 1 counter from it to then buff your team. This is an all-star with a Drumbeller on the battlefield, because what you can do is on opponent 1's turn, you tap to put a 1 counter on it. On opponent 2's turn, you then tap to remove the 1 counter to put a 1 counter on each other creature you control. So what this essentially becomes is per turn cycle, we're going to be buffing our team with 2 1/1 counters on each creature. So just an absolute all-star case in that scenario. And if you want to avoid sort of that initial buildup, you can absolutely cast this where X is equal to 3 and just start tapping to remove 1/1 counters on it to then buff your team immediately. So very, very versatile card, whether it's played in the early game or the late game. Our haste enablers, it starts and ends with 1,000-Year Elixir. It's a 3 mana. You may activate abilities of creature control as though those creatures had haste. Basically allows us to skip the whole summoning sickness component, and we can pay 1 to tap untap target creature. So just a great value card overall. And I wanted to mention in the haste category overall, another card that I had really considered but did not quite make it off the cutting floor is Lightning Greaves. That's just another all-star in Commander. And the reason why I don't have this is because it's a little bit too utility. It doesn't really provide enough value, in my personal opinion, for 2 mana. Yes, it allows us to have that protection, but the fact that Derevi can always be cast for 4, regardless of commander tax, means that this card gets a little bit less good, because we don't necessarily need to leverage the Shroud component as much on our creatures. Yeah, it would be nice to have it on the field with like a Seedborn Muse or a Drumbeller and make sure those are protected, but we're going to be playing so many value creatures that it's not really going to matter too much. It's really the haste that we would use this card for, and at that point, I'd rather have something like a 1,000-Year Elixir that will give all of our creatures haste. Another consideration for this category was it's the Defender. Let me see here. I'm actually blanking on the name. Concordant Crossroads is a great option as well, but also Crashing Drawbridge is what I was thinking of to give all of our creatures haste. Concordant Crossroads is a great option. In fact, you might even want to consider including this because it's just so efficient for what it does. But the fact that it gives our opponent's creatures haste is just a little bit too scary, and that's why it did not make the cut. Finally, in our protection category, we have Teferi's Protection, which is basically you and all permanents you control phase out and you can't lose life, which is great. And the extra utility of Teferi's Protection is that it guarantees assuming we aren't infected out of the game or milled out of the game or something niche like that, that we will hit our next untap step. So Teferi's Protection, another sort of boring commander staple, but it just has so much synergy in this deck because it guarantees that next untap phase. And then let me see if there's any other stats we wanted to review. The lands, of course, we have to cover the lands. So the reason why I like to look at the lands this way is I think it presents more of a story for the lands. So we are running a total of 32 green color producers, 27 blue, 26 white. If we look at Moxfield, that is a little heavy on the white and blue for what we need. However, this deck is pretty pip intensive, which is why I have so many color fixers in the deck. The mana base is emphasizing color fixing more than utility, which is why we only have 5 tapped lands and we only have 7 utility lands. I am not including any, let me filter this for a second. We don't have any of the channel lands such as Boseiju, Iganjo, Odawara, although I would like to include those. It's just that we really need to be focused on fixing our colors, because Derevi we want to be able to cast right away if we need to, and we also just have a lot of pip intensive cards such as Arcanus, such as Azami, such as Patron Wizard, and cards like Sarah's Emissary. There's just a lot of pips that we need to be solving for. So that's why we are running a lot of fixers. And then let me just filter on the utility lands. So we're running Lorien Revealed, which will fix us for all colors because we can tutor up OG Duels, which, by the way, I highly recommend everybody proxy because they're just too expensive and they're too valuable for what they do. Manamo School at Water's Edge will allow us to untap a target legendary permanent, so that is great synergy in this deck. And Plaza of Heroes will allow us to protect a legendary permanent in a pinch. Let me see, where's Plaza of Heroes here? We can always use this to cast Derevi on turn 3 or turn 4. Notably, it cannot be used in Derevi's activated ability, so that is something to be aware of. However, the reason why it's really in this deck is because Derevi is typically not worth removing because we can cast it right away again. We will always have Derevi on the field, meaning Plaza of Heroes will always tap for banned colors. So that's just extra synergy there. Eagles of the North is going to allow us to, again, tutor for any land, and most importantly, it can function as a pseudo combat buff in the late game if we have nothing else to do. In particular, it gives our creatures +1/+0 and first strike, and that first strike is absolutely huge because it gives our opponents sort of a pause for how they want to be blocking if they only have something like utility creatures on the board, and maybe we need that extra little bit of a buff to put our creatures over the edge. Generous Ent is another just late game card if we have nothing else to do and we don't want to cast it for its land side, aka using its 4 cycling ability. It's a 5/7 with reach. When ETBs create a food token, so just a nice big body if we need to block a giant fatty. And then Simic Growth Chamber can allow us to return a land we control to our owner's hand, and it can be used to untap with Derevi. You can, I think there is an argument to be made to include more bounce lands in the deck. I only have Simic Growth Chamber as the green-blue one. However, I might look at the green-white bounce land in here as well, maybe in substitution for something like a Horizon Canopy. But I did want to, again, kind of focus on entering untapped, making sure we can cast our mana dorks on curve. And I love bounce lands just because they effectively say ETB draw a land, which is always great because we can be fixing our later land drops. All right, so that is the deck. Let me check really quick to see if I missed out on any other information that I have included in my notes here, and I don't think I did. So that is going to conclude this deck tech, my very first Commander deck tech with Derevi Empyrial Tactician. I hope you guys enjoyed. I will be releasing a companion video after this video that will show this deck in action via gold fishing, and to show that it can generate a dominant board state by between turns 6 and 8 if left uninterrupted. So stay on the lookout for that if you are still interested in what this deck can do. As always, I will have the deck links in the description for both Tapped Out and Moxfield, depending on what site you like to use. But that will conclude the video. Thank you all for watching. Again, if you like this content, leave a like. Feel free to subscribe if you like this kind of stuff, because I will be producing more of it in the near future. But that is the video, guys. Thank you all for watching again, and I'll see you in the next one.